Have you ever imagined a man who spent his nights waist-deep in human waste, crawling through the darkness beneath a medieval city? It is not a metaphor nor an insult, but a profession that truly existed. In the kingdom's silence, these men were called the Gong Farmers. In the great castles and crowded towns of medieval England, toilets did not flush away their contents. Instead, waste collected in deep cesspits hidden beneath timbered halls and stone streets. When those pits filled, someone had to descend into the choking darkness and remove what no one else dared touch. That someone was the Gong Farmer. They worked at night carrying buckets of filth up ladders slick with damp, their lungs filled with poisonous fumes. For this task they were paid more than many honest craftsmen, yet despised by nearly everyone. Neighbours avoided them, and their very presence at market was unwelcome. Yet without their hidden labour, the glittering banquets of lords and the daily bread of peasants alike would have been threatened by disease and decay. It is a paradox, the dirtiest hands kept the kingdom alive. The documents that speak of these men are few, often hidden in tax rolls, city ordinances, or faint notes in the margins of parish records. Their names rarely reach stone memorials, yet their existence shaped the unseen rhythm of medieval life. What survives today is fragile ink bleeding into parchment words written by clerks who likely held their noses as they recorded the duties of the Gong Farmers, and so we read centuries later of men who climbed into the earth to clean what all others abandoned. This is not the history sung in ballads or painted in royal halls. It is the buried truth of survival. You are now uncovering secrets never told, directly from the British Library. In a parchment volume preserved within the archives of the City of London, a clerk once noted that 2 men were paid 4 shillings for the emptying of the pit at Bishopsgate. The entry is brief, buried between accounts of bread weights and fines for market disputes, yet it is enough to illuminate a profession most would rather forget. These records, dated from the late 15th and early 16th centuries, confirm that the Gong Farmers were not legend but fact. They were hired by the city, sometimes under contract, their wages calculated in precise detail, as though their work was no less essential than that of a mason or a carpenter. And yet the record offers no names, no voices, only a line of numbers beside the task. Their humanity dissolves into ink, leaving us to imagine the men who descended into the darkness. What is most unsettling is how rarely they are described beyond these financial notes. They were present everywhere, for every city had its cesspits, and yet they remained invisible. Neighbours avoided them, taverns closed their doors, and guilds refused their membership. The very word gong, a term for excrement, became their lasting identity, erasing whatever personal dignity they might have carried. Chroniclers preferred not to speak of them as if the act of writing their existence might stain the page itself, and so they became shadows, indispensable in function, but absent in memory. Why would a society build cathedrals of stone and celebrate the grandeur of knights and kings, yet push its most vital workers into silence and shame? Why did laws quietly protect these men while the people shunned them? What does it mean when a community survives only because of the hands it refuses to acknowledge? These questions are not only about the medieval world, but about how societies past and present decide whose labour is honoured and whose is hidden. Tonight we descend into that forgotten world, not to judge but to listen. And the echoes of those cesspits may tell us more about power, survival and memory than any gilded manuscript ever could. Medieval cities were not designed to handle the sheer volume of human life pressed within their wooden walls and stone gates. Narrow streets became crowded with livestock merchants and refuse. Waterways already burdened with industrial waste from tanners and dyers could not safely absorb the constant stream of human filth. As populations swelled in towns like London and York, the problem of waste grew into a silent crisis. Chroniclers wrote of the stench clinging to markets, the foul air drifting into noble halls, and the outbreaks of illness that seemed to follow every summer. To walk through the lanes of a medieval city was to encounter the unavoidable reminder of the body's decay, and yet few spoke openly of how it was managed. Beneath the rhythm of bells and prayers, an invisible system of removal was needed if society was to endure. Instead of running water or sewers, most medieval households and castles relied on cesspits, deep stone-lined holes dug into the earth where human waste collected for years at a time. Some were built beneath latrines, others tucked behind kitchens or stables, often hidden under wooden covers. When these pits filled, they threatened to overflow into living quarters, poisoning wells and spreading disease. It was here that the Gong Farmer entered history. Hired by the city or by private households, his task was brutally simple: descend into the pit, remove the waste by bucket and transport it beyond the town walls. In London, carts of filth were hauled to designated dumping grounds, sometimes spread across fields as fertiliser. The job was indispensable, for without it cesspits would flood streets and halls alike. Yet the worker who made this survival possible was rarely seen in daylight. He was called only when the stench became unbearable and dismissed as soon as the pits were cleared. The Gong Farmer's descent was a journey into suffocating darkness. They worked at night not out of choice but by decree, for the law demanded that such labour remain unseen. Lanterns offered little relief in the damp, airless holes, where walls dripped with moisture and gases gathered unseen. The pits were often 20 feet deep, with ladders slick from constant damp. To climb down, carrying nothing, and return carrying buckets heavy with filth was to risk life with every step. Many accounts speak of sudden fainting fits, men overcome by fumes of methane and ammonia, collapsing in silence at the bottom. Death could be instant, unnoticed, until morning. Protective clothing did not exist. They wore simple tunics and boots, sometimes smearing themselves with vinegar-soaked cloths to fight the stench. Payment was high compared to other trades, but no coin could erase the humiliation of labouring in filth, or the ever-present fear that the pit itself might become a grave. Their work was performed in silence, hidden from view, so that cities could sleep without smelling their own survival. What made the Gong Farmer's occupation paradoxical was its wage. City records from the 15th century show that they were paid more than skilled craftsmen, sometimes earning 6pence a night, when a mason or carpenter might receive only 4. The reason was not generosity but necessity. Few men dared to descend into the pits, and so demand drove the price of their labour high. Municipal councils knew that without these workers, waste would flood the streets, bringing plague and revolt in its wake. Their pay reflected danger and scarcity, not respect. Even so, the coin was often spent in silence, for the money of the Gong Farmer was considered tainted. Neighbours muttered that such wages were unclean, earned not by honest skill but by crawling through filth. Thus the richest irony, the dirtiest work, brought the most silver, but it purchased no honour. Despite their higher earnings, Gong Farmers walked the streets like exiles. Chroniclers noted how people recoiled from their approach, mothers pulling children aside, merchants whispering about the smell that clung to them. Guilds, the brotherhoods of medieval trades, refused them entry, for no one wanted to dine beside a man whose hands had touched what the city expelled. In taverns they were shunned, their coins sometimes refused by innkeepers. Even church pews could be closed to them, as if filth carried into the soul. This rejection created an invisible barrier more suffocating than the cesspit itself. They lived apart, earning in one night what others made in several days, yet unable to spend their wages in fellowship. Their name became their sentence gong forever, tied them to excrement, a reminder that in the medieval imagination, a man could not rise above the work that stained him. The archives preserve grim reminders of the peril hidden beneath the city. One record speaks of a Gong farmer in 1326 who was found lifeless in the pit, overcome by foul air. Others mention sudden collapses, the noxious gases robbing lungs of breath, leaving men unconscious before they could climb the ladder. In some cases, death arrived without a sound, the worker discovered only when his bucket failed to rise. Rumours spread that the pits themselves devoured men whole, swallowing them into their darkness. Accidents were not only fatal to the worker, but threatened those above, for an uncleared pit meant the waste would seep into wells or rise through floorboards. Yet the city could not stop calling for more men to descend. For every body carried out, another was paid to take his place. Thus the cycle endured peril, death, and replacement written in the margins of forgotten ledgers. Though despised in daily life, the Gong Farmers were not without protection. City ordinances in London and York forbade citizens from harassing or obstructing them while at work. In some boroughs, laws declared that their labour was essential to public health, making interference punishable by fine. Ironically, the very system that spat upon them in daylight relied upon the law to shield them at night. This legal recognition placed them in a liminal space outcast to their neighbours, yet necessary servants to the Crown and Council. They lived in contradiction, holding a kind of authority in their work, for without them cesspits would overflow, and noble households would suffer first. The paradox is unmistakable, legally indispensable, socially untouchable. It is here that the medieval world shows its clearest hypocrisy, to depend utterly on a man, and yet to despise him all the same. In a society obsessed with visible purity, the line between clean and unclean was drawn with brutal clarity. Nobles bathed in scented waters, priests consecrated their altars, and merchants scrubbed their stalls to attract buyers. Yet all this cleanliness rested upon the unseen filth, carried away in the Gong Farmer's bucket. The man who smelled of cesspits was considered unfit for guild church or table, even as he enabled the illusion of purity for everyone else. This contradiction whispers through the records. A city polished its stones for processions, while the waste beneath rotted, managed only by those forced to embody the dirt of others. The clean were those who could afford to hide their filth. The unclean were those condemned to bear it. In this inversion we glimpse the uncomfortable truth. What appears spotless is often built upon hidden stain. Here lies the deeper riddle. Who was truly filthy in the medieval world? Was it the Gong Farmer whose body reeked of the labour he performed, or the citizens who pretended their lives were untouched by waste? The farmer faced his task directly, acknowledging the decay of the human body while society turned away, clinging to the fiction of cleanliness. Perhaps the greater stain was not the muck on his clothes, but the disdain in others' hearts. To reject the man who preserved the city was itself a moral corruption, a refusal to honour necessity. And so the cesspit becomes more than a hole in the ground. It becomes a mirror. In its depths we see not only waste, but the uncomfortable reflection of a society that cast out the very people who made survival possible. The question remains whispered across centuries: who was truly dirty? The figure of the Gong Farmer may seem distant, yet the pattern he represents is still with us. Modern cities, with all their glittering skylines and promises of progress, depend on the unseen labour of sanitation workers, sewage engineers and waste collectors. Without them, water would stagnate, disease would rise and order would collapse. Their jobs are safer than those of the medieval cesspit diggers, but the social perception has hardly changed. These workers often face ridicule, invisibility, or even disdain despite being as essential as doctors or architects. Every time garbage is cleared before dawn, or a clogged sewer is quietly repaired beneath the street, the old paradox returns. Civilization rests upon shoulders it does not acknowledge. The medieval Gong Farmer and the modern sanitation worker are bound by the same truth. When their labour stops, society crumbles. Respect may still lag behind necessity. The British Library preserves fragile testimony to this hidden profession. City ordinances from the late Middle Ages detail the regulation of cesspit cleaning, sometimes with precise instructions on when and how the work was to be carried out. Ledgers record payments 4 shillings for the clearing of the pit without naming the men themselves, as if anonymity was part of their wage. In museums, one can still see the physical traces, stone linings of cesspits unearthed during excavations in London, their bricks darkened by centuries of use. Displayed beside these are parchments, contracts and accounts that anchor the grim reality in ink and clay. They remind us that history is not only preserved in crowns or manuscripts, but in the dirt that cities produced and in the workers who carried it away. These silent objects force us to remember what society once tried to forget. What then does this story reveal about justice as society? Reveals its values not in its monuments, but in how it treats those whose labour sustains daily life. The Gong Farmer was indispensable, yet despised his dignity denied in exchange for survival. That contradiction is not only medieval, it echoes whenever necessary work is dismissed as shameful. Justice demands that we recognise value beyond appearances, beyond the stench of the cesspit, or the uniform of the waste collector. True cleanliness is not the absence of dirt, but the presence of fairness, the willingness to honour all forms of labour. When we ask who was truly unclean, the farmer or the society that scorned him, we are also asking a question about ourselves. To overlook the people who preserve our comfort is to carry a deeper stain than any pit could hold. History leaves us with the uncomfortable truth: dignity buried is dignity denied. So what do you think when a society survives only because of the hands it refuses to acknowledge? Was the true stain in the filth of the cesspit, or in the contempt of those who turned their eyes away? Should dignity be tied to appearance or to the necessity of labour? Share your thoughts below. This is a question that history has left for us to debate together. If you believe knowledge is the oldest treasure, keep this manuscript safe with a single act of preservation. Subscribe. Our journey leads to the eerie world of the leech collector. At dawn, these men waded into stagnant waters, letting leeches cling to their skin sold to physicians who swore by bloodletting as a cure for nearly every illness. Half healer, half outcast, they risked pain and disease for survival. Next time, discover their strange trade and the haunting medicine of the plague years. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.